Good evening, everybody who has joined us. Thank you for joining the second webinar of the PD Green Program's Spring 2022, Spring 2023 Justice Education Series. And so my name is Mako Fennell, and I am the outgoing Director of Equity, Inclusion, and Justice Education for the PD Green Program. And so in my role, I'm responsible for both internal and external diversity, equity, inclusion efforts. On the volunteer side, I help volunteers think about the broader context that create mass incarceration and the educational environments of the learners that they support, and also connect them with the thinkers, activists, and organizations that are pursuing systemic change. I also come to this webinar tonight as a professor at Virginia Union University, where I'm teaching a course this semester titled The Black Family in the Age of Mass Incarceration. So in partnership with the Center for African American History and Culture at Virginia Union University, we are presenting this webinar. So over 100 of you have gathered with us this evening to learn about how Black women and Black girls became societal afterthoughts and victims of domestic, carceral, and anti-Black violence. So in conversation with Black feminist historian, Dr. Treva B. Lindsey, author of America, Goddam, Violence, Black Women, and the Struggle for Justice, we will grapple with the history of violence and criminalization of Black women and girls, while also learning of their strivings for justice. So we want all of us to be able to leave this webinar with knowledge that will help us all confront the ways in which all of us participating in making Black women and girls societal afterthoughts, and with an expanded vision of justice. So in a few minutes, I'll introduce you to our guest for tonight, Dr. Treva B. Lindsey. And she and I will be in conversation about her book, America, Goddam, Black Violence, Black Women, and the Struggle for Justice. But before we get into that part, I want to explain why this conversation is important for an educational justice organization. So the mission of the PD Green Program is twofold. First, the PD Green Program supports the academic goals of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people through high-quality volunteer tutor programs. Second, we aim to educate volunteer tutors on the injustices manifest in the carceral system. Ultimately, we want volunteer tutors to be advocates for systemic change and educational justice. So we understand that volunteer tutors are voters, might go into careers focused on social justice, might become parents, might become policymakers, might make decisions on where to send their kids to school, or people who will make decisions about where to work and where to live, might make decisions about giving money to social change organizations, and will make a bunch of other political decisions in their lives. So we want volunteer tutors to go beyond charitable volunteering that does not confront the edifices that create and support injustices. We expose them to thinkers, activists, and organizations focused on systemic change in hopes that they join their efforts, or at minimum, make justice-oriented decisions. So today's webinar picks up on a conversation that we had last spring about educational opportunities for currently and formerly incarcerated learners, focused on educational opportunities for currently and formerly incarcerated women learners, okay? So as we began discussing then, women or girls are left out of conversations about educational justice for currently and formerly incarcerated people. Even though incarceration rates for women have increased 7-fold since the early 1980s. Black women and girls are especially treated as what education justice advocate Kimberly Haven calls correctional afterthoughts. This is the case despite their disproportionate criminalization and incarceration in the United States. So let's talk about that. To do so, I'm going to read an excerpt from America Goddam. All right. This is in chapter 2 in the section called Locked Up, written by Dr. Treva Lindsey. The United States has the largest prison population in the world. As reported by the Bureau of Justice Statistics in 2013, more than 6.8 million people were under some form of correctional supervision, which includes prison, jail, probation, or parole. In 2019, nearly 1.3 million women and girls were under correctional supervision. Around 18% of women and girls under correctional supervision are incarcerated in federal and state prisons and jails, local jails, juvenile detention centers, and immigrant detention centers. Almost 7,000 girls are confined in juvenile facilities. 61,000 women currently confined in local jails haven't been convicted of anything. Of the girls locked up in juvenile facilities, 10% are held because of status offenses such as running away, truancy, and incorrigibility. According to the report, The Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline, the girl's story, most status offenses are often related to abuse. These data points exist at the core of what scholar Beth Ritchie identifies as America's prison nation. This kind of nation comes into existence through ideologies and public policies that criminalize communities of color and that routinely undercut the rights of disenfranchised and marginalized groups. The convergence of the power of public policy, law, and institutional practices in deciding what constitutes criminality and violation within civil society disproportionately criminalizes Black people. The U.S. prison nation, as noted by scholars, activists, and artists such as Beth Ritchie, Andrea Ritchie, Miriam Kaba, Angela Davis, Emily Thuma, Julia Sudbury, Regina Arnold, and many others, has a particularly carnivorous appetite for us. Although men, especially men of color, make up a disproportionate percentage of those under correctional supervision, increasingly Black women and women of color are the raw material that fuel the prison industrial complex. Tough on crime approaches coupled with the criminalization of poverty render Black women and girls particularly vulnerable to incarceration. Black women are in prison at twice the rate of white women in the US. Black girls constitute a disproportionate percentage of those in juvenile detention centers as well. Criminalizing Black womanhood and girlhood not only reinforces long-standing racist and sexist stereotypes about us, it is profitable. The US prison nation comes to life via a criminal punishment system shamelessly committed to taking lives and livelihoods of those it never intended to protect. The US prison nation also exploits the labor of those trapped within. This nearly unpaid labor helps to generate billions of dollars for those profiting off the prison industrial complex. It may seem cliche to acknowledge that the criminal justice system isn't broken, but in fact, it's working exactly as it was designed. Although I agree with the sentiment, many of us remain unfamiliar with the core design elements and features of this system and believe in the future possibility of its delivering justice. It's why we demand the arrest of police officers who assaulted, even killed people. It's also why we often turn to the criminal punishment system for justice for Black women and girls who've been harmed. Far too frequently, many of us perhaps unremember or overlook the anti-Black and misogynistic origins of criminal punishment system. We struggle to make sense of a system where 5 Black women could die in police custody in a single month, or where we incarcerate a woman who fired a warning shot into the air to defend herself from an abusive ex-partner. This is why we are here. We are here to uncover this history, learn how it presents itself today, and think about how we might undo it. So we are here for the 17-year-old Black girl whose jaw was broken by a school resource officer after being falsely accused of possessing mace. The 17-year-old Black girl in a bathing suit dragged by her hair by McKinney, Texas police outside of a pool party. The Black girl who was brutally assaulted by a South Carolina deputy. The 11-year-old special needs Black girl who was tackled and pinned down by a police officer at school. We're here for Tanisha Anderson, Ayanna Stanley Jones, Janie Liggins, Marissa Alexander, Atiana Jefferson, Centoya Brown, Kendra Chapman, Olu Taween Salu, Brisha Meadows, Joyce Cornell, Shanta Singleton, Laline Extravaganza, Cece McDonald, Essie Stroman, Una May Love, Brittany Cosby, Diamond Ross, Tanisha Anderson, Eleanor Bumpers, Rakina Jones, Samira Kareem, Krista Jackson, Sharina Thomas, Alexa McGovern, Ayanna Dior, Aisha Frazier, Victoria Sims, Misty Cross, Tolini King, Renee Turner, Ethan Estrada, Montana, Jocelyn Allen, Dominique Walker, Megan Thee Stallion, Dakota Peters, Mbete Ndonga, Jasleen Busanet, Baby Girl, better known as Aaliyah, Serena Williams, Erica Harper, Deborah Daner, Amriana Copany, Shamika Young, Shaisha Washington, Dr. Shanice Wallace, Henrietta Lacks, Kira Johnson, Relisha Rudd, Amir Luwali, Makia Bryant, and Treva Lindsey. We say their names to make sure that we don't forget, but also so that we can undo systems that harm them. So now I've done a lot of talking and a lot of framing. I want to introduce you to Dr. Treva Lindsey. So I've known Dr. Lindsey for over a decade. And while I'll call her Treva, for the sake of this conversation, we're going to go with Dr. Treva Lindsey. So Dr. Treva B. Lindsey is a professor of women and gender and sexuality studies at Ohio State University. I'm sorry, at the Ohio State University, and the co-founder of the Black Feminist Night School at Zora's House. She's a Black feminist historian whose work focuses on African-American women's history, Black popular and expressive culture, Black feminism, hip-hop studies, critical race and gender theory, and sexual politics. Her first book, Colored No More, Reinventing Black Womanhood in Washington, D.C., uncovers how in the early 20th century, Black women in D.C. resisted subjugation and attempted to make the nation's capital a more equitable place. Her second book, America Goddam, Violence, Black Women, and the Struggle for Justice, uncovers the history of misogynoir, anti-Blackness, and criminalization to help us understand the violence experienced by Black women and girls at the hand of the carceral state, medical professionals, social services, and by those in their homes and communities. America Goddam also demonstrates how Black women and girls resist these systems to get closer to freedom. All right, so we were now getting started. Thank y'all for bearing with me for that framing. I think it was necessary for this conversation. All right, you ready? Hey Treva, how you doing? I'm sorry. Hey, Dr. Lindsey, how you doing? All right, you see me? Can you hear me? We can't hear you. Can you unmute Dr. Lindsey? We can't hear her.
Hello.
There you go. You're good. Or you switched up on it. So thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you for bearing with me for that long introduction. I once pursued the preaching ministry, so I still haven't learned how to keep it brief. So welcome. So I've been knowing you for about a decade, and I first knew you as a 21st century hip hop feminist, writing about hip hop women in hip hop and hip hop studies. And I know you as a historian, and now your first two books are have made significant contributions to the canon on the history of Black women in the nadir or the Black women's movement in the early 20th century, and making significant contributions to how we understand anti-Black violence or like carcerality, how it impacts Black women and girls. And so before we get started with like all the big questions, how do we get from hip hop feminism to what we're doing now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone who is tuned in today. So I would say there's a connection between all of this. I'm always interested in the spaces in which Black women are contesting white supremacy, are contesting patriarchy, misogyny, sexism, anti-Blackness, ableism, capitalism. And what I found as a hip hop feminist really gave me a language to think about all of those oppressive systems. But I had to look at a thing that I loved. I had to look at a culture that had been so instrumental in my own understanding of self and my understanding of community. It's a space where I got to think through race and class and gender and sexuality and representation and representational politics in really robust and expansive ways, and also very challenging ways. And it was very clear in the context even of being a hip hop feminist that there were many examples of when hip hop didn't seem to love me, and by me here, stand in for Black women, Black queer women, standing in for Black poor girls, Black hood girls, Black girls, Black gender expansive folks broadly. And so I wanted to think alongside both in my book about DC, about the women who get written out of the narrative of how Black people reshape this nation, and specifically how these women in Washington, DC were fighting for freedom and equality. And more recently, to really bring back to the ways that we talk about anti-Black violence in the United States and what's at stake when we don't talk about the experiences of Black women, girls, gender expansive people, and when we have a very narrow framing of what violence looks like. And so hip hop always gave me a way to think through things expansively, but it was always meant to be accessible. And it was also meant to be able to think about these big systems, but also get at the intimate. What happens when the people who are harming you, saying terrible things about you, devaluing you are people that you share community with, that you consider kinfolk in certain ways, that you feel an intimacy with, a certain kind of vulnerability with. And so that led me to wanting to grapple with the ways that intra-communal violence, right? What happens in our communities, in our institutions, as well as what's happening to our communities and to our institutions, and put them in conversation with one another to draw a bigger picture of the experiences of Black women and girls in the United States.
Yeah, and I think you did that well. I think what the book does for me is, make plain like why we have to say say her name. And so we see the hashtag, we hear about it, and we really heard about it a lot after Breonna Taylor was murdered, which we'll get to. But I think the book makes plain, why we have to say her name, and we'll get to at the end how hip hop feminism, that analysis and being a hip hop feminist, how that plays out in the text. And when we think about, most recently, the shooting of Megan Thee Stallion, and the conversations around that, and why how that's important. And so I guess you talked about this a little bit, but like, why did you write like America Goddam at this moment?
Yeah. So I was running from this book for a long time. I had been researching and collecting things around it for almost a decade. I've always attended violence in certain ways in any of the work that I do. And this goes back to my undergraduate work. In the book, I mentioned that I directed and choreographed a production of For Colored Girls Who Consider Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough, which in many ways deals with violence against Black women and girls, among other topics. And so it's always been a part of the work that I do. But this investment in doing a book-length study of violence against us that takes us from the dank and dark spaces of the slave ship and the hold all the way to a bedroom in Louisville, Kentucky, with a Black woman sleeping who's gunned down by police.
Yeah.
I wanted to make that kind of connection, but I wanted to run from it because I knew how emotionally taxing it would be. I knew how vulnerable it would force me to be as a survivor of violence myself. I knew that it would require being accountable to these communities in a very different way than being a historian and being accountable to the record and accountable to telling the right story, telling a layered story is important. But this is loved ones who've lost somebody and they're living. They can respond to this. They can have feelings about this. This is still very raw for a number of the people that I'm talking about in the book. And so I ran. And then 2020 happens. And Breonna Taylor's killed. And it's so interesting because she's killed on March 13th, 2020. George Floyd is murdered on May 25th, 2020, but we don't really at a national level hear anything about Breonna Taylor until the murder of George Floyd, which once again highlighted the ways that Black women who were killed by police, who were harmed by police, is often not getting the kind of groundswell attention and mass mobilization that otherwise would. And then I went home to DC during the shelter in place. I drove home to see my mom and then encountered an instance of a Black woman being assaulted by her partner and having to intervene, and all of that story. I tell that story in the book. And ultimately, those two things combined told me, okay, this is the moment. You have to write this book. This book is chasing you. This book is telling you that it needs to be written, and it needs to be written now. It needs to be written with a particular kind of urgency, and it needs to feel deeply personal because it is. The stakes are high for me as a Black woman in writing this and having this accessible to a broad audience.
Yeah. Thank you. What I appreciate about the book is that it's you take the what we call the long durée of history in the U.S. of violence against Black women, but it's also part memoir because you're impacted by these historical forces and the present forces, and then you also provide what the biblical writer Paul calls like a way to escape. All right, so let's get into this book. So as I mentioned to you when we were doing our prep, that the audience that's here today is mostly volunteer tutors that are college students. These are people that are supporting the educational goals of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated learners. You have people that are in the prison education communities and others that are concerned about justice. So before we dive into the book and to these big themes of the book, I want to talk about kind of the frameworks and theories that you use to make your arguments so that we can all understand where you're coming from. And so I'm going to throw out a term, and I'm hoping that you can briefly define what it is and how you use it in the book. So there's a couple of them. I know that there's whole books written on each one of these, but the first one is, I know this is not your term, but I know who it comes from, but like racism as premature death.
Yes. So in brief, this is a term where I'm really deriving and citing Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Black feminist abolitionist and geographer, who's really helping us to understand that what racism does, right? It's less about what racism is and what racism in fact does. And what it does for people who are marked within a racial hierarchy in which white supremacy is kind of the organizing principle that hierarchizes racial groups. So the proximity to whiteness versus the proximity to Blackness are hierarchized in a particular way. That hierarchy means also where you are positioned in terms of predisposition to premature death, right? So your life expectancy is shorter. You're dealing with various kinds of health ailments, whether that be physical ailments, social ailments. You are feeling the brunt of deprivation and scarcity. And that way we're either slowly or spectacularly dying. And what we see is, of course, a shorter life expectancy for Black people, and also a slow death process, even for those who do get to live a long time, that what's happening to their bodies and what they're warring against is still predisposing you to a death that you otherwise might not encounter in that same moment had you not had to deal with what racism does in the lives of racially minoritized people, and specifically in this case, Black people.
Yeah, yeah. What I've always liked about that is that the way that we learn about what racism is, probably through K-12 education, is discrimination. Okay.
Yeah.
Or like a feeling, or like about or what or like intent. Okay, like that, like in these intentional acts. But this is about like systems and structures and practices that produce premature death. Anti-Blackness.
So anti-Blackness takes this a step farther. This is how we get to understand the ways in which the United States and places all over the world, because white supremacy is a global phenomenon, sadly, operate. So anti-Blackness is the kind of concentration of ways in which this group that is placed at the bottom of the racial hierarchy is positioned in relationship to the state, in relationship to access, in relationship to resources. And this manifests in a whole bunch of ways. This can manifest in violence, which is often what I'm talking about. So anti-Blackness and policing, the ways that stereotypes, ideas about Blackness, long-held concepts of Blackness, scientific racism around Blackness. Black people don't feel pain the same way white people do. Black people are more predisposed to commit crimes than other groups. Black people are less smart than other groups. All of these things are rooted in anti-Blackness, that there's something fundamentally opposing Black life and Black existence. So once again, it is systemic, it is structural, and it is institutional.
Right. Violence.
Ooh, so this is probably the hardest one for, because in the book, I'm talking about a number of different forms. So people are used to violence, like I hit you, that's a form of violence. And maybe we talk about psychological violence a little more now than we do, but we don't often talk about the violence of deprivation, the violence of scarcity, the violence of being on the margins of society. So what that, again, puts you in proximity to. So you're in greater proximity to harm, and this amasses in particular ways to create a violent context. So your proximity to harm and your proximity to grief, right, are amplified in this way. And so violence for me is things that enact on people that impact how they're able to move through the world, right? And so it's an act of harm, absolutely. And it is something that is deeply rooted often in creating power dynamics, maintaining power dynamics, or establishing power dynamics. That violence is often operating out of a system of power. Now, that can still be in an intimate partner relationship who has dominance, or that can be at the institutional level in which we see policing or carceral systems that are telling us that these people are not fit to be here. So we can violate them. We can evacuate their personhood from our minds and treat them any kind of way.
Yeah, yeah. Good. The next one is misogynoir.
Yeah.
I know I'm jacking it up, but
it's a hard word to pronounce. It's a very hard word to pronounce. Misogynoir.
Yes.
I think that's only because I speak French that it's a little bit easier for me.
Yeah, my grad program didn't require me to take no languages.
No,
So. All right.
And I have a French teacher from back in the day, so he'd be very proud of me that I can say this. But misogynoir, so people are familiar with the term misogyny, which is the hatred and mistrust or fear of women or femininity more broadly. And misogynoir, as coined by Moya Bailey, is a term that really gets at the specific kind of racist and anti-Black misogyny that Black women, girls, femmes, gender expansive folks who identify as feminine are often experiencing. So misogynoir can come up in representation. The Jezebel is a great stereotype that we hear about. And by great here, I mean one that has a real deep entrenchment in popular culture, the kind of hypersexual, oversexed, licentious, unrapeable Black woman and girl. It is both a racist term, but it's also rooted in a hatred and a fear of Black female sexuality. And so when those things combine, this is what we get misogynoir. It's not just the system of sexism, which is really important in understanding power dynamics, pay gaps, all of these kind of big institutional things. Misogynoir is also systemic, but it is deeply connected to the ways that anti-Blackness and misogyny can collude with one another and show up in terms of fear. So never trust a big butt and a smile, right? As much as I love that line, it is very much so rooted in this idea that you should fear, mistrust, not believe, not support, and not care for Black women, girls, and gender expansive, feminine identified folks.
Yeah. The next one, multiple jeopardy.
Yes. So multiple jeopardy, a term coined by Deborah King, amazing Black studies scholar, who was trying to think about a way to say, how do we talk about the simultaneity, right? The simultaneous experience of different forms of oppression. And so Black feminists for centuries have been grappling with how we account for this, whether it's Mariah Stewart in the 1830s, thinking about women of the darker races and the particular conditions that sexism and racism led to for Black women, or Mary Church Terrell in the 19th century processing something similar, to Pauli Murray talking about Jim and Jane Crow. So Jim Crow being a racial segregation system, Jane Crow being a system in which sexism organizes power and order, and double jeopardy as coined by Frances Beale, Black feminists that think about racism and sexism. So multiple jeopardy is saying that there are multiple oppressive forces that are interlocking, interconnected, and impact as a super force almost in the lives of marginalized people. So multiple jeopardy leads to people being multiply marginalized. So I am Black, I am woman, I'm queer, right? So I can experience homophobia, queerphobia, sexism, misogyny, patriarchal violence, and anti-Black violence. But all of those combined look a specific kind of way. And so multiple jeopardy allows for us to account for what happens when you can't just tease those forms of violence or forms of harm out, but they're actually working together to create the conditions for premature death, create the conditions for being overly primed for violence happening.
Right. Three more. Unlivable lives. I love this. I'm going to start using this in conversation. Unlivable lives.
Yeah. So Unlivable Lives is a riff on Butler, who's a great theorist, and talking about what it means when you're living, but all of the conditions that are surrounding you that inscribe your life are largely unlivable. Like most people would not be able to survive them. And I took this riff because I was looking at, again, I'm a 19th and 20th century historian. The motto for the training school for colored girls is started by Nannie Helen Burroughs, who's a very famous race woman, activist, did all the things, that said, we specialize in the wholly impossible. That was the mode. And so what we're often understanding is that Black girls and women, in this case, who I'm looking at, are conscripted to survive the wholly impossible. They're supposed to survive food insecurity. They're supposed to survive not having clean water. They're supposed to survive inadequate housing. They're supposed to survive inadequate schooling. They're supposed to survive. And there's just this expectation that you can survive what is indefensibly impossible to survive. And so this idea of unlivable living is that people who have been at the margins and at the margins of the margins have had to live in these unlivable conditions in spite of the fact that these things are simultaneously wearing them down.
Yeah. It's good. Goddam. And wait, it wasn't until reading this book that I realized that goddamn doesn't have an N at the end of it. All right, so goddamn.
Yes, the goddamn is like, it's the informalizing of it, right? I know a lot of people do put the N at the end because damn has an N, but goddamn, right, is that blackening of the space, right? Black language practices. But damn for me was this visceral response to every time I hear a new story about a Black person being harmed, a marginalized person being harmed, disabled person, whatever marginalized group filled in. Like, I just like, God damn. Like, when we hear about another shooting at a school, like, there's no part of me that ever wants to be desensitized to hearing about another act of violence, because that's a very specific grief that those loved ones in that community has to reckon with, and they should not be symbolic or illustrative, but it is a very hard moment and hard life post-violence. But goddamn, is that just thing that comes from your gut in that reaction. And so I'm a Nina Simone head. I love Nina Simone. Her having a song and it being the first song that she did that was a protest song ever in her career, and that it's honoring the lives of Medgar Evers, a civil rights worker, and the four little girls, Carol, Denise, Cynthia, and Addie, who were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in 1963. That was orchestrated by white supremacists in Alabama. That the fact that she had that reaction of goddamn, right? She's naming these places across the country, although she is focused on Mississippi in the chorus, the refrain, she's naming other states because she knows that it is America's problem that we have. Sorry, I just started Beyonce, right? America has a problem.
Yeah.
In saying that. So the goddamn is that thing that captures that. Like, it's a frustration, it's a rage, it is a sadness, it is a fury, it is all of those things rolled into one, and it is a call out of what US is and continue to perpetuate.
Yeah. Good. So why is history important to understanding this present moment of state sanctioned and interpersonal violence against Black women and girls? Like, what do we miss if we don't look to history for answers?
Yeah. So, I want to think, because I'm a historian, I'm like, well, you have to have history, but meaningful past here for me, don't get to understand prisons and our penchant for criminalizing Black people without understanding that the very ways that our carceral, our penal system develops, our criminal legal system policing develops in the US is directly in relationship to the policing of Black people and the white property. And to be clear, Black people were property in that figuration of that. And that each generation, each era of white supremacy is anchoring itself in that logic and just reshaping and remixing the technologies and the structures by which it can enact that same initial goal. So that same aim is still undergirding that. So I talked about in the book, there's a moment where these clinics in the wake of the 2020 uprisings are putting around domestic violence centers, are putting up Black Lives Matter signs in front of their buildings, putting up in their windows to kind of signal to people who might be surviving or victims of intimate partner violence that this is a safe place. This is somewhere where your Black life will be valued. And police responded by refusing to offer protection or services to those institutions, to those organizations, because they said that Black Lives Matter. So even those police are saying you can't believe in policing and believe that Black Lives Matter. That's a very telling thing to have it happen. Can't believe in a system that has been rooted in the policing of Black people, the criminalizing of Black people, the removal of Black people from society and from their families and communities, most importantly, and be supportive of what it means to actually stand up for Black life, right? That those are actually opposing forces that have different histories. You have the history of people resisting that, which is the struggle for justice, and you have the people who are trying to maintain those systems, those structures, and they're using the same logics that have been used from slavery to the present. They just get remixed depending on what the kind of legal status of the Black person is in any given era.
Yeah. What I tell people is that if you want, so I say that, mass incarceration is a historical phenomenon, okay? And if we want to like undo mass incarceration or carcerality, then we have to understand the multiple causes that created this particular phenomenon. And so, yeah, thank you for that. All right, so let's get into this book, and we'll kind of move through this. So you titled chapter 1, like "Say Her Name,"
Yes.
policing is violence. In this chapter, you offer a long history of policing in the U.S. with a specific focus on the impact of policing on Black women and girls.
Yes.
Pulling from the stories of Black women and girls who lived in the late 20th century and early 21st century, whose encounters with the police led to their death, sexual assault, and or bodily or emotional trauma. You basically argue that Black women and girls matter too, that their lives and victimization matter and must be centered if we are to do a full cost accounting, Neil Painter, of violence, of policing, and undo the violence of policing. So you make several arguments, including police are arbiters of subjugation, controlling racial boundaries and violating Black folks. Police have an anti-Black disposition. Violent policing disproportionately impacts Black women and girls. Black women are 14 times more likely to be killed by police than white women. Black women are often harmed by police outside of public view. Ableism heightens the possibility of police violence. And referring to police violence against Black women and girls, you say, if we don't see it, or if it doesn't occur in ways that we can readily recognize, these cases become exceptions as opposed to illustrative of the depths of anti-Black police violence.
Yeah.
So this gets me to a question about being seen and heard and erasure. What has happened when we didn't say their names? And what happens if we continue not to say their names, particularly related to Black women's and girls' experiences with policing?
Yeah. So I think what happens on one hand is that often when there is no public pressure, we have even less of a chance of any form of accountability happening within the existing criminal legal system. I mean, that's just a fact. And it's sad because even with considerable public investment in certain issues, we've of course seen numerous non-indictments and in far too many cases when it comes to Black people who are victimized by police. That being said, there could always be another narrative, and we still live in a culture and a society that believes police quite often. So if there's no video, there's no testimony, there's no push that's coming from outside of the structure of policing, the institutions that bolster policing, we get whatever narrative we're told. So we can get that this person resisted. We can get that this person was violent. We can get all kinds of things that can be so far from the truth. And in that way, we don't actually get an opportunity to even attempt to hold anyone accountable for the kind of harm they cause, whether that's sexual violence, fatal police violence, assaults, criminalization. We don't get any of that. And far too often with Black women and girls, and I would say most people, if I ask them about Black women and girls who've been killed by police specifically, Breonna Taylor is one of few that most people could name. And she only becomes legible once George Floyd is killed. And also in the aftermath of Ahmaud Arbery, who's not killed by police, but by white supremacist vigilantes. And so I think that there is something really important to get at in saying, what does it mean that because there's very rarely video, there's very rarely audio, and there very rarely are witnesses to what is happening to Black women and girls, that we can still get narratives that we have to just accept as truth. And Say Her Name provides a corrective and a space in which we get to seek a truth. We get to understand what happened to this person and who this person was before this spectacular moment of harm occurred. That's also why it's important that we don't reduce the women and girls and gender expansive people that I talk about in the book to this singular moment, that there are people who had interest, they are beloved. And when they are harmed, it creates a climate of grief around them as well. And that climate of grief can also be death dealing. And so their names allows for there to be a space of intimacy, vulnerability, and proximity to harm, as well as healing in the aftermath of these various forms of policing as violence.
Yeah. It made me think about Kimberly Crenshaw has a famous TED talk, Say Her Name and Intersectionality, where she has the audience like sit down once they hear like a name that they're familiar with. And I think like most people keep standing because they haven't heard of these like Black women. So let's get to like Breonna Taylor. So you also in chapter 1, you wonder why in 2020 did the murder of Breonna Taylor by the Louisville police garner so much attention. I mean, like Queen B, actually like wrote a letter to the state prosecutor. You didn't get the joke, did you, Queen Naja from
Yeah.
Swarm?
Yeah.
So Beyonce wrote it at the state prosecutor. Topin Wigway penned the song calling for the arrest of the cops that killed Breonna Taylor. So, at a most basic level, we know that on that day, the same day that the White House announced that COVID-19 was a national emergency, that Louisville police garnered, that Louisville police entered the home of Breonna Taylor on a no-knock warrant, and within minutes, Taylor was wounded by 5 or 6 bullets that were ultimately fatal. So, can you make plain your arguments in chapter 1? Can you talk about the confluence of factors that led to the police murder of Breonna Taylor?
Oh, I mean, that's a tough one, but it's a really I would say the confluence of factors is one. Okay, so one of the things I talk about in the book is the fact that so many of these murders of Black women happen in their homes, right? They happen in spaces that are supposed to be safe and out of the sphere in which we see these encounters with policing. But when you have things like no-knock warrants and you have people who've already overdetermined Black people as criminal or in proximity to criminal behavior, and they are criminalized subsequently, it's very easy to get a no-knock warrant to target someone who's presumed to be in an apartment where drugs are at or affiliated with a person who's there. And mind you, of course, the narrative has changed since we first heard about how the warrant went down, why it was there. There's some ties to gentrification that are happening here with this building. There are so many factors, all of which signal the fact that inevitably that day, that Black woman was probably going to be harmed by police. Whether it was, this idea that they knew that whomever was in there deserved to be harmed. Because once you've criminalized someone, once you've said their personhood is less valuable or completely without value, you don't actually care what happens. And you don't care what happens to those around them either. So you shoot indiscriminately and possibly harm people who aren't even targeted in that warrant. It was eerily familiar to the murder of Aiyana Stanley Jones, who was a young girl who was asleep on her grandmother's couch as a show about police was filming and taping this raid on a house. Turns out it was the wrong apartment. And this ends up with a girl being killed on her grandmother's couch, right? And Taylor being killed in this supposed criminal activity, because of supposed criminal activity that was happening out of this apartment. And even if that criminal activity had been happening right at the moment in which those police walked in what world is that a death sentence? Mm-hmm. Right? Even in the worst case scenario in terms of what Breonna Taylor or whomever in that apartment may have been doing, it still would not have warranted the murderous approach that policing has. But when you've decided someone is criminal and you've decided someone is of less value and you've decided that they deserve to be put away and not deemed fully human, fully person, it becomes very easy to dismiss any kind of semblance of care, any kind of semblance of engagement that would suggest that this person should walk out of this situation alive and unharmed.
Yeah. It made me think about how the war on drugs created warrior policing, how gentrification depends upon like removal.
Yeah.
and this removal is often like violent, and like, requires like criminalization and all of that, like led to like her murder. Um, so in chapter 2, you move away from police encounters that led to the deaths or emotional or bodily trauma of Black women and girls, to the jailing, prosecution, and imprisonment of Black women and girls. So this chapter urges us to think about uh, the impact of mass incarceration on Black women and girls beyond their relationship to imprisoned Black men as mothers, lovers, sisters, and friends. You argue that criminalization kills Black women in custody, and that one causal factor for Black women's incarceration is because they are not allowed to defend themselves from the violence that they experience from intimate partners or abusive family members. So while there are many names that you mentioned, I'm wondering if you can talk to us about the stories of briefly of Sandra Bland, Marissa Alexander, and Cece McDonald to help us understand deaths in police custody and imprisonment for responding to violent victimization.
Yeah. So with Sandra Bland, which is, I think, probably after Breonna Taylor, one more common names that people know about or have heard about in some way. And some of this is because she was particularly visible on social media, and she dies in police custody after a very violent stop by police that did not need to be a violent stop in any way, didn't even really need to be a stop. This is a failure to change lane stop that ends up with a woman dead within 72 hours after being stopped, in addition to being assaulted and accosted by a police officer on the side of the road. She had traveled to Texas to start a new job. She was full of promise and full of possibility. And 3 days later, she's not here. And it is galling. It is gutting. I think seeing the image of her and her mugshot, but then all of these other images of her, I think just hit a chord with people that I had not seen prior to that point with regards to Black women and girls being harmed by police. And I say harmed by police that although it appears that her death is, official cause of death is a death by suicide, that there's no way that Sandra Bland would have been dead had she not been stopped by police in the first place for such a petty offense, and is in jail and incarcerated. There's no checking on her mental health and well-being, any of that that's happening during this process. And so she is one of the Black women who is died in police custody in July of 2015 alone. And most people would know all of their names. In the book, I discuss all of them and their stories, but whether it's medical neglect, people being in such mental distress that they unalive themselves, there is incredible violence in the ways that people are held in custody, and once incarcerated, the kinds of harm that befalls them. And so that is something I wanted to bring out, that we don't understand the carceral state without understanding that the possibility of death in police custody is far higher than it should be, and Black women and girls are overrepresented in those numbers. For someone like Marissa Alexander, it's a fascinating case. She is someone who is coming out of a domestic violence situation. Her ex-partner is at her home. She's very concerned. She fires warning shots into the air, which does not harm anyone. And yet she ultimately is facing, at a certain point, almost 60 years for having fired warning shots, which she tried to do in terms of standing her ground. And this is in Florida as well. This is very shortly after the murder of Trayvon Martin. And the same prosecutor, in fact, who is prosecuting George Zimmerman, who obviously he's found not guilty in the murder of Trayvon Martin. And then Marissa Alexander, she's seeking all kinds of aggressive charges for someone firing a warning shot. She did not want to actually harm someone. She just wanted the situation to be over. So she was being punished for not harming him. And it stands to reason. I think she also would have been charged had she actually shot him, because in many ways, Black women and girls are not afforded the right to self-defense, that is a right that is often rooted in white supremacy, and who gets to be protected and who doesn't. Callie Gross, a historian, talks about the US operating on an exclusionary politics of protection, and Black women are excluded from a politics of protection to protect themselves, to protect their homes, to protect their communities, and they should be afforded no protection by the state. And this, of course, extends to someone like a C. McDonald, who's a young Black trans woman who is the victim of a violent anti-trans attack and defends herself, and in the defense of herself ends up killing someone, which is not her intent. It is during a brawl that this occurs, and is charged with the killing of this person. And she, because of transphobia, because of anti-Blackness, because of misogynoir, there's an incredible push to have her incarcerated and framed as a murderer, someone who intended to kill, someone who was never attacked. And yet we know, by and large, that Black trans women are facing all kinds of attacks on a day-to-day basis, from the police, from intimate partners, from communities, that trans violence and anti-trans violence against Black women specifically is horrific. The numbers of Black trans women who've been subjected to violence at some point in their life is so overwhelming and almost exceeds every other group in terms of proximity to violence at any given point in their lives. And so with CeCe McDonald, you see her transness and her Blackness and her womanhood criminalized. With Marissa Alexander, you see her survival criminalized as well in relationship to dealing with an abusive partner. And Sandra Bland, we see her criminalized for failing to change lanes and being in conversation with a cop about why she's being stopped and how aggressive he's being. And he escalates the situation to the point where she is arrested after being assaulted and then left in a jail cell to die.
Yeah, yeah. That brings us to the next chapter, which is a conversation that I didn't want to have in public, in front of company, but it's something I think you do an excellent job of dealing with that tension, and also why it's necessary. So, chapter 3 is titled "Up Against the Wind: Intercommunal Violence," and you pick up where you left off in chapter 2 by naming names. Specifically, you tell us who is harming Black women and girls. It's the Black boys and Black men who love them and who are in community with them. But before you even get into the stories, you do so much explaining about the tensions and the potential for contributing to pathological arguments about Black men and Black people in general. Mm-hmm. It made me think about when in the introduction you say, to be clear, this is not Oppression Olympics. Can you talk to us more about this? Why did you have to say that?
Yeah. I often feel like the response is very defensive when we talk about what is happening with violence, specifically when we get to intercommunal. When we're all saying the shared enemy of policing, and we see that as outside of the community, that's a lot easier to get people on board with and to rethink and to reconsider. And also because from just a straight quantity standpoint, Black men and Black boys are going to have far more violent encounters with police than Black women. Black women are the next biggest group across race and gender with that. But that notion of coming into contact with policing, we know there's a very particular history around what Black men and boys will face in policing. However, the idea that being specific means you're being competitive or adversarial or trying to ignore, erase, or deny a particular history is something I wanted to cut off at the pass, which is why I put it in the intro. This is not about an Oppression Olympics. This is about accounting for the specific ways that Black women, girls, and gender expansive people are encountering violence. And many of us are encountering it because we exist at the intersection of multiple systems of oppression. And that is important to understand. It is also important to understand that one of those intersections includes patriarchy, misogyny, and sexism. And then if we further complicate that to get even broader in terms of how we understand violence against marginalized folks within Black communities, Black LGBTQ folks across genders. And so it meant a lot for me to really work through how I would talk about this without in any way contributing to the narrative of Black on Black crime, which is a phrase I discuss in the book, is why I don't use it as a phrase. Most crime happens intracommunally, violence happens intracommunally. The people who harm you are people who are in proximity to you, and segregation, redlining, predatory lending, and all kinds of other structural and systemic reasons. Black people live in proximity to Black people. So it is not surprising that is who harms here. But talking about boys from the slave cabins to current times in terms of their relationships to Black women is often talking about the role that patriarchy plays in structuring Black communities as well, and having a very real, honest, hard conversation about the ways that patriarchy shows up in terms of homicide rates for Black women and for Black men and boys, because the majority of Black men and boys are also killed by Black men and boys. And so that's also patriarchal violence. And so one, give people some language to talk about how dominance, how patriarchy, how these systems and gender norms and sexuality norms that we've inherited contribute to the ways that we harm one another. I deeply care about this. So I want to understand why 4 Black women and girls are killed every day now. When I first wrote the book, when I first started writing the book, it was 1 every 19 hours. Now it's 4 every day are being killed. And most of them are being killed by Black men and boys. And so I wanted to get at that in a way that held pathology at bay, but also said, we can't keep pretending that this doesn't happen. And we can't keep pretending that this is not consequential in the big picture of Black liberation. We can't get free if we are in this intimately violent relationship with one another.
Yeah, I like what you just said, that when we think about an abolitionist vision, and what we're building, part of that is the undoing of patriarchy is part of an abolitionist vision. And so as I was like reading this, it took me back to my first time reading Beth Ritchie's Arrested Justice and her concept of male violence, and that was hard for me as a grad student at that time, and I got caught on it, and it was like, these are what the statistics are saying. And so, to your point, white women are killed by white men. Latinx women are killed by Latinx men and boys. Black women are killed and harmed by Black men and Black boys. And it made me think about something that Kiese wrote in Heavy, in the first chapter, after he talked about his experience of molestation and also witnessing a rape. He said, my body knew things that my mind couldn't, maybe wouldn't express. It knew that in all of my neighborhood, boys were trained to harm girls in ways girls could never harm boys. Straight kids were trained to harm queer kids in ways queer kids could never harm straight kids. Men are trained to harm women in ways women could never harm men. Parents were trained to harm children in ways children would never harm parents. Babysitters were trained to harm kids in ways that kids would never harm babysitters. My body knew that white folks were trained to harm us in ways we can never harm them. And it made me think about my stepdad like hitting on my mom, and like me not being able to do things. My father squaring up against my stepmother, and the experiences of like the Black girls in my middle school and high school that we call like fast for going across the street and being picked up by the drug dealers, not realizing that that's fucking sexual predation. And they're girls, and we didn't have that language at that time, or not realizing that we're on an 8th grade activity bus singing 12 play, and this dude is talking about like little girls, or not realizing, not having a language to understand that, wait, Aaliyah is only maybe 1 year older than me, and why we didn't understand that. But so I guess, can we hit on how this intracommunal violence and this desire to protect Black men and boys because of the knowing of what happens, how this played out with most recently with, a famous person, Megan Thee Stallion.
Yeah. It's challenging. I saw today that, Tory Lane's defense team has officially filed for a new trial. And part of what will be part of this, their motion, whether it will be granted or not, is that was there prosecutorial misconduct by them bringing in the music video that he is when he's chopping up the horse in it, and then the Instagram account where someone posted on his Instagram that Kelsey did not shoot Meg, which basically was kind of the defense that was being circled around during the initial trial that happened in December. And so it will be interesting to see how this all plays out. But what was so telling about that case is that Meg did all the things that I think so many of us who survive encounters of violence do, particularly when it's someone we had some kind of intimate relationship here with. And I don't mean always intimate in the context of romantic or sexual, but just intimate. That could be a loved one, that could be a friend, that could just be someone that you've shared a level of vulnerability with, which also tells you why she was not truthful about whether they had a sexual relationship or not. There's a disbelief and a shock that someone you shared intimate space with could be the person who harms you the most. And so on the night of the shooting, right, she doesn't say to the cops that this is what happened. She is really trying to protect him. She's trying to protect everyone on that scene from what could happen if police intervene and knew that there was a gun in the car. I mean, we've seen what happens when people are unarmed, let alone when a Black person is armed, what that could mean consequentially for everybody there. And so she chose not to speak out. And she really was trying to exist outside of that. In the book, I talk about silently enduring and unequivocally protecting, that she was following this kind of ride or die ethos here in that moment, not because she was going to go back to dating him or not seeing him for as a person who harmed her, but because she was like, I am not going to die in this moment because this person tried to harm me. And I also don't want to deal with the criminal legal system. But because lies start circulating about who shot her, that people are calling her a liar, that people are being derisive, dismissive, even making jokes about her being harmed, and she has to come out and say, this person shot me, that Daystar Peterson shot me, and I tried to spare him, and y'all are not sparing me. And she talked about when she testified during the trial as a witness, which is all she is in the trial, is a witness that is being called by the prosecution, is that she'd rather he had just killed her that night if she knew she was going to have to deal with everything she had to deal with after this happened. Like being shot by someone you cared about, having this relationship dissolve, having people call you a liar, people make fun of her, people not care about her pain, people not see her as a victim. If I'm watching this and I'm the victim of intimate partner violence, I am less inclined to want to go through this process, come forward and share my truth, because it feels like a separate victimization on top of the victimization that you've already experienced.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So we are at 7:14 right now. Typically, I'm not moderating this long, but I want to let the audience know that please use the Q&A function to put questions in there. I'm going to move the conversation now to practice, like how do we put these ideas in practice. And so our volunteer tutors learn about the carceral state in their training, okay? Mm-hmm. And they learned that the carceral state encompasses like formal institutions, operations, and economies of the criminal justice system proper, but it also encompasses like logics, ideologies, practices, and structures that invest in tangible and sometimes intangible ways in punitive orientations to difference, to poverty, to struggles, to social justice, and to the crossers of constructed borders of all kinds. So I was really glad to come upon 2 chapters in America Goddam that cover medical violence and then also unlivable living as a form of violence. In these chapters, you deal with the logics, ideologies, and practices and structures that invest in like a difference to poverty, difference in Blackness. and Black womanhood. So 2 questions emerged from this. Why did you make this choice is the first question. And then the second one is, can you talk more about how unlivable living makes Black women and girls vulnerable to being swept up into the criminal punishment system, into communal violence, and more unlivable living?
Yeah. So with medical violence, one of the statistics that had started to gain some traction at a national level as I was thinking about this book was Black maternal morbidity, that we were seeing that, so many Black birthing people were dying in childbirth, specifically Black women. And it was just harrowing to see that a Black woman with a PhD, such as myself, was having similar outcomes as a white woman without a GED, right? And this is not about creating a hierarchy here to say someone should have better outcomes. Everyone deserves good outcomes. But the hypothesis prior to this was that it was an education and class thing that was showing up. And it wasn't. And then people talk about race, but they weren't talking specifically about racism. They weren't talking specifically about anti-Blackness. And so I wanted a chapter that really dealt with the history of the medical system and its ties to anti-Blackness, which are deep and rich. And so many of the ways that Blackness is constructed is through the construction of science around difference and science around hierarchized difference. So enslaved people are experimented upon for medical developments. They are harmed in these processes. They are determined as less than human. And so when you get studies in the 21st century that say that medical students who are currently training don't believe that Black people feel pain the same way that white people do, you have to trace that back to the fact that the earliest medical journals in this country are attesting to that very reality.
Yeah.
And so I wanted a chapter that really showed why you see so many Black people who don't trust the medical industrial complex, why that's not an unfounded trust, and what it means that you see Black folks overrepresented in so many poor health outcomes, be it cancer. So Black women are less likely to have breast cancer, but we're more likely to die from it, right? These are things that are really important to start to unpack, or the groundswell of Black women who have autoimmune disorders. And we're starting to see more and more research around that. And if there were anything in this world that 80+% of white men got, there would be a national committee, crisis centers, institutes. But we don't have anything like that for fibroid tumors, which is something that Black people with uteruses, and specifically in this instance, so many Black women and girls in my own life have had to deal with, that impacts the ability to have gestational capacity, to give birth, to have a normal kind of healthy life in regards to reproductive care. So those were the things I wanted to cover there. With unlivable living, I really wanted to look at poverty. I really wanted to look at what happens when you're at the intersection of multiple failures and multiple sites of deprivation, so that you're unhoused, you're unfed, your schooling is poor. Like, what happens? In a lot of cases, Black girls go missing. That's one of the outcomes that can happen. Another outcome is the people we see ending up in the juvenile detention center for all kinds of things, right? For being runaways, for engaging in sex work, which when you're a minor, it's not sex work, it is literally various acts of sexual violence that you're enduring. So I think that it was really important for me to say, here are these ways that these systems are colluding with one another. These were some of the best examples of multiple jeopardy that I could provide. The ways that poverty, that capitalism, extraction impact the fact that we had 64,000 missing Black girls and women, and now we have 90,000, right?
Yeah.
That we're seeing intensification of that. We're seeing an intensification of trafficking of Black girls and women, and partly because traffickers know that people do not care and do not go looking for Black girls who go missing. There are no Amber Alerts for us in most cases. There is no systemic care. There is no missing Black girl syndrome when Black go missing, and media attention and all of that. So traffickers are aware of that and aware of the devaluation that makes, even if they get caught, they feel that they'll be able to get away with what they're doing with impunity. Because part of the conditions of anti-Blackness are being able to enact white supremacist ideologies and logics and terror and violence with impunity.
Yeah. So I got 2 more questions, and I think there's a question in the chat that will be answered from this. So So when we are like training our volunteers, they learn about like carceral humanism. Okay, so Caleb Martinson and Betty Ritchie define it as points to the ways punitive institutions work under the guise of care, which can involve building relationships with social services in the community. When social services become co-opted by the carceral state, however, it results in carceral humanism, a discursive strategy of rebranding or repackaging carceral control as the caring provision of social service. Carceral humanism also helps us understand how punishment is duplicated in institutions and by persons oriented to help. So we try to avoid duplicating that punishment in our work or being used as an arm of the carceral state. So for those that are here, like what lessons from the book should social service organizations, educators, prison education organizations, policymakers, and volunteers, tutors take away to use in their practices with Black women and girls?
It's a great question. So what I would say, one is the first step is listening. I feel like often Black girls, Black women aren't listened to when we do talk about our experiences or given space to talk about what our experiences are. Black women are very knowledgeable about what's happening to them, as are Black girls. And so when people have the mantras, listen to Black girls, believe Black women, stand for Black women, I'm talking about that as a practice, not as a hashtag. And what that means to listen is to listen for the lower frequencies of what is being said to you. So do you feel safe in these spaces? Right? What are things that make you feel cared for? Some of this is asking and talking to Black girls and women about their needs, about the ways that they want to be shown up for. So often we have an idea that if we take a model that we've used and plop it down, that this will work universally. And quite often we're not attending to our own biases, we're not attending to our own relationship to privilege and power in that moment. And so some of this is really shedding that and letting Black girls tell you where they are. And you have to be okay with their anger, their fury, their sadness, their frustration, their disappointment, and stop expecting Black girls and women to be resilient. The strong Black woman, the strong Black girl, she's mature for her age, all of these kinds of figurations of Black women and girls that we use sometimes to seemingly be celebratory are really denying them full access to their personhood and their humanity. We shouldn't be creating conditions in which Black women and girls feel they have to be resilient or show up for everyone or save everyone. So look at the labor that has been asked on the plates of the Black women and girls that you work with, that you encounter, and see if they're doing a disproportionate share. How might you step in to alleviate some of that burden, to redistribute some of that work, right? Redistribute some of that burden, right? These are ways that you can actively engage in countering the narrative of resilience that we've been conscripted to, while also listening to the specific needs that Black girls and women that you're interacting with are articulating to you.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think so. In these streets, we talk about being trauma informed and then being trauma responsive. And what I think we've been able to do in this last hour and a half is be trauma, like be informed about trauma. And that last question was, okay, well, how do we be responsive to that trauma? And I want to say thank you. I'm gonna have to close this. I want to say thank you for talking about hope and also resistance. That people often ask me, well, how do you study history and not get angry? And I was like, shit, well, I do. I do get angry. And you mentioned in the book that everything that you write can make one like pessimistic and feel that there's no hope. But you draw on Miriam Kabbalah saying like hope is a discipline, and that part of this abolitionist vision is like imagining new worlds, okay? Imagining the world that we want. So I appreciate that. And I just appreciate you for just making this plain. This is recorded so other people will be able to see it. So thank you for that. So everybody that's still with us, we thank you for hanging out with us tonight. there are two things that are going to happen now, though. So we do this this work in support of currently and formerly incarcerated people. That's where our dollars go. But we also think it's important that we are educating folks on the injustices manifest in the carceral system. And so that's not funded. And so please donate. Go to the PD Green Program .org and donate. You can send us a Venmo, PD-Green Program, and you can send us money there. And we have another webinar. Our final webinar this semester is called "What is to be done." Black college students confronting the carceral state, where we're looking at student organizations that are doing work in educational justice to confront the carceral state. So we thank you for that. There is a song that's going to play, and there's a survey that will lead us out. We thank y'all very much. Keep tweeting. You can find all of us on the web, and it has been my pleasure for the last 2.5 years to be able to do things like this. And I'm sad that I'm bouncing, that I'm leaving, but thank y'all for allowing me to do this, and thank you for hanging out.